Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. Ukraine's president is playing the last card up his sleeve, his trump card, if you will. Zelensky is now inviting President Trump to his country to try and wrest another year of support from the U.S. as the Democrats and Republican establishment who once feted him and hailed him as the man of the hour are now returning their gaze and dollars toward the Middle East. Zelensky even tried to plan a solidarity tour with Israel, but was rebuffed. He's had to fire about a dozen high-ranking officials for corruption. Insiders say the money being sent to Ukraine is being stolen like there's no tomorrow. The counteroffensive failed. Both sides are said to have lost over 100,000 lives. And so the conscription age in Ukraine has had to be increased, causing the average age of soldiers there to hit 43. All that, and the fighting still remains at a World War I style stalemate. It's been an unmitigated disaster. And now the same U.S. and European leaders who demanded that Zelensky not agree to any peace deal terms last year after the invasion, even when he wanted to, are now pressuring him to do the opposite, to make concessions and to end the war. Like Henry Kissinger always said, to be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be your friend is fatal. His usefulness is now past its time, and so he'll be discarded to the same fate as other past friends like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. Now, not saying those men were angels at all, they were evil. But we did use them, and then we killed them when they were no longer useful to us, plunging the entire region into worse disorder and chaos than if those men were allowed to remain in power. And so Zelensky heads toward the same terrifying fate. The terms of any future agreement to end the war seem very likely to fall along the lines of the Minsk II agreements that he should have just abided by in the first place to avoid all this unnecessary bloodshed. But the West filled his head with the impossible dream of freedom, when really the West just wanted to turn Ukraine into a Western client state instead of it being a Russian one, in which Ukraine would be made to destroy its land, its young men, and its hopes to just weaken Russia. That's it. Despite all the lofty claims and virtues we heard piously intoned by the Biden administration, that's all the West wanted from them: to die, in the hopes Russia would die first, like how chemotherapy kills the patient slowly, in the hopes the tumor dies first and then the rest of the patient's body can be nursed back to health. A future peace deal similar to the Minsk II agreements will likely include Russia to return to the Donbass region, the language, for Russia to keep Crimea, and for Ukraine to not join NATO. Entrepreneur Arnaud Bertrand has some salient points on this. He argues, quote, "In fact, there's no understating how significant this is. For the past 2 years, we've had NATO countries send hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, a quantity of weapons so enormous it depleted their own reserves, a vast undisclosed amount of mercenary soldiers, and threw everything but the kitchen sink in terms of sanctions to cripple Russia. The result? It simply didn't work. NATO is now suing for peace, and Ukraine will probably end up having lost at least a fifth of its country, a territory half the size of the UK. All this after having been told during almost the entire duration of the war that Ukraine was winning. Of course, people will be told that it's not a defeat, merely a stalemate, that NATO comes out of it reinforced with additional members, that it's Ukraine or Zelensky's fault anyhow, blah, blah, blah. But the crux of the matter is NATO defined an extremely clear objective, which was to drive Russians back to pre-invasion lines, to directly quote Antony Blinken. And that failed miserably despite their unprecedented efforts, which means that the West is much less powerful than they thought they were. They just couldn't collectively defeat Russia. This has immense implications, first of which being, if they can't defeat Russia, what hope do they have against China, which is likely, just looking at metrics, number of people, production capacity, military budget, etc., at least 5 times more powerful? The answer is obvious. Another one is that all those places around the world who thought they were protected by the U.S. will start, in fact, they're already starting, to ask themselves, wait a minute, that protection isn't worth much, is it? And so we'll likely witness very significant shifts of alliances and protection arrangements. Lastly, people in Western countries will at some point wake up from their propagandized haze and ask very simple questions like, why did we ruin ourselves for Ukraine with almost nothing to show for it? Wouldn't we and the Ukrainians have been better off if we'd respected Minsk II, and if we hadn't tried to convert Ukraine into a Western bulwark against Russia? And so this will likely serve as a hard lesson domestically, that we'd be much more humble about our geopolitical ambitions, assuming the West is still capable of learning lessons, which is far from certain. All in all, this will undoubtedly be seen by history as the defining event that signified we moved from Western hegemony into a multipolar world. A very long chapter of our collective world history book has just been closed, end quote.